Well, hello. Allow me to introduce you. And this amazing book that you have put out. I don't know if I should show this, but you can edit it out if you need to. But Ken Derry, a dear friend of mine, associate professor at University of Toronto teaching stream, and you are also the head of religion, film, and visual culture at the American Academy of Religion.
I think just until, maybe until about 7 o'clock this morning.
Yeah, well, until after the chair's reception.
Oh, so. Okay, that's true. Yeah, so I'm one of the co-chairs of that group, but
yes.
I'm rotating off as of this meeting.
And so you were responsible a few years ago, in response to the release of Force Awakens, of putting a panel together at the AAR, which has evolved into this book that we have.
Yes.
And I think it's, I think, as you say in your introduction, that it's a text which is necessary because religion scholars, for whatever reason, don't want to touch Star Wars and haven't put books out on it previously.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you could actually, by way of introducing you, if you could speak to why that's important and especially your sense of fun and play, which you talk a little bit about.
Why it's important to have a book on Star Wars and religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of reasons. So, as you know, one of the things that was surprising to me when I went to write the introduction to the book is I thought, well, I'll put the book in conversation with other books that religion scholars have written on Star Wars, and I didn't know of any, and I felt that was a failing on my part, and so I went, actively and enthusiastically looking for them, and I couldn't find them. And I was really shocked by that. And so then I started asking other people if they could tell me about the books out there that religion scholars had written on Star Wars, and nobody knew of any. And everybody else kind of responded the same way, like, well, there has to be something, but nobody could think of one. And so that changed the framing of the book for me, actually, and the introduction that I wrote. But it did seem astounding that no one had done this, and especially since there are so many books on religion and Star Wars, but none of them from people in our discipline. So you have folks in English or psychology or politics or theater studies writing academic books on the topic. And then you have a lot of people within religions writing about religion and Star Wars, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism or Christianity. So you had that whole group of books, but nothing actually by religion scholars. So it was this incredibly rich and popular topic that we hadn't touched. And it seemed amazing, considering the force, so to speak, of Star Wars, that we had ignored it for so long. So that was the first thing, was just how surprising it was that we hadn't done it. And then the second thing was to think about, I guess, the two questions: why haven't we done it, and then why should we do it?
Yeah, and it seems to matter to so many academics. Like when you start talking about Star Wars at a conference, people have real stories about that, about their interactions with it, about their love for it. And then, but there's a sense that that kind of love for something which is popular shouldn't be brought into academic spaces or conferences like the AAR.
There's a sense among some people, for sure. And then I think in some ways, though, the AAR becomes a space where it is okay for some people to do that kind of work. Right. But that's as far as they take it.
Right.
And then the occasional person will maybe write an article or so, right? So there are articles and chapters here and there by religion scholars about Star Wars, which I had known about. And so I just thought, well, that's just obviously kind of the tip of, even if it's a small iceberg, there's something else out there, but there wasn't. What I knew was all there was, that was, as I said, that was kind of a shock.
It is a strange silence, given how much religion scholars will work with theories of myth. And you mentioned Eliade and Joseph Campbell, and the closeness of those, especially Campbell working with Lucas, staying at Skywalker Ranch and all of that stuff. So I think there is, well, I don't know if it was Skywalker Ranch at the time, but
it was, I think, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that was an early development.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe not have been during the first film, but soon after that, once they connected.
Well, to me, that seemed to lend itself very naturally to religion scholars wanting to say something about it. Is that a major theorist that a lot of people, at least at the time, were working with, is getting used very directly in something which starts looking very religious on the other end of with the development of fan movements and what have you in the 80s, that starts, I think you're looking at a genesis event, and it gave us a real opportunity as scholars to look at it.
That we missed.
Yeah,
like to be in on the sort of ground floor. I mean, you know, obviously with the first film, I mean, pretty quickly, people knew it was a phenomenon. It was, I mean, I was very young when it came out, but I remember, and I didn't react to the film that way. I remember seeing it and thinking, well, that was great. And then that was the end of it for me. But then seeing on the news, you know, that people were seeing it, you know, 10, 20 times, and I was just amazed by that. And so, you know, we knew early on that this was a phenomenon. And we knew early on that George Lucas was deliberately using the ideas of Joseph Campbell to make the film, and yet religion scholars ignored it. And they ignored fan responses to it and the whole thing, which is troubling. So one of the things, as you know, that I talk about is the fact that in some ways this represents a larger problem where, you know, of what we value and what we don't value within, I would say, the within the academy generally, but within the study of religion in particular, where, you know, we want to look at all of the quote unquote important things. So we study sacred texts, you know, official sacred texts, for example, and you know, we publish in important journals that have high impact factors. And what gets lost, it seems, is well, a lot of things actually. One is we miss something obvious, like this is a huge, important aspect of our culture and of people's lives, and we're just ignoring it. But you know, I talk about Michel Desjardins and his work, and you know, he switched from being a sort of early Christianity New Testament scholar to looking at religion and food among people now, and how that switch, when you shift what you study, it changes how you study it.
Of course.
And so, you know, when you're looking at sacred texts, I mean, one of the things that happens is you're looking at men a lot, you know, because these are, you know, male author texts, and the subjects are men, and they're for men, so you have to do a lot of work, you know, if you want to kind of have a kind of equitable scholarship, or a scholarship that recognizes and values diversity. You've got to really push against that thing that's built into what you're studying. But if you shift your focus and you look at food or popular culture, suddenly that's not so much of an issue anymore. So, you know, and you know, fan cultures of Star Wars, for example, have included girls and women from the beginning. And so, as much as, you know, it has been in the films a very male-focused kind of narrative, and that's shifted obviously recently. But even when it was male-focused, the communities were very diverse.
And one of the chapters in the book kind of explicitly focuses on that. I think it's Chris Claussen's chapter.
She mentions that.
Issues of gender and shift, and the kind of which woman is worthy to be a hero in some cases.
And also recognizing that girls had identified with Luke, for example, even though he was a male hero, but that when you shift to female heroes, I think she uses the phrase, it's sort of the possibilities, right? The imaginative possibilities open up.
And that's one of the issues also with the way that race representation was going on, which was the impetus for the initial panel, which was, are people getting, because when the ad came out for Star Wars, The Force Awakens, Jason Boyega is featured.
His head pops up.
In the beginning, and this caused a massive racial backlash online. And so when you were designing it initially, it was also another group that doesn't get to be drivers of the narrative now are factoring importantly in it a little bit. And that's what the chapters on race touch upon as well, is that I think it's compelling because religious studies is going to be inherently interdisciplinary. So when the chapters are people coming at it from very different angles. So it's just, even if you're looking at the bibliography, you're looking at combinations of racial theory, religious studies theory, and Star Wars. Like that's neat, even if you want to see how to connect those things. And you didn't talk about it, but I love that your notion of play, that it's meant to be that because we know it's not real, but we're allowed to be. We know that being harsh with it is not that's not the mark of good scholarship. That's just a mark of cruelty.
That's a nice way of putting it. And you can be critical without being cruel, as you say. And that when there's a sense of fun or play, one of the things that bothers me, I think, about some academic work or some academic missions is it becomes about some sort of important conclusion to something, and that becomes, you want to have a grand theory of something, right? And it can flatten and distort and harm, and I make a reference to Sam Gill's discussion of Eliade doing that same kind of thing, or Masazawa talking about the way in which religious studies in many ways has been a colonial project,
right?
And I think a lot of that is tied to this sense of self-importance, and that if we kind of turn the volume down on that a little bit, it actually opens up the possibility to do better work, more genuinely kind of critical work, and work that's open to various ways of seeing, while still you can critique, for example, the Star Wars films for being problematic in terms of things like race and gender.
Yeah, well, I think the book deals with, you've got everyone who's written in this volume is what Ronald Jenkins, a fan theorist, would describe as ACA fans or academic fans, right? That they all love it, but they're also critical and deeply critical of the ways in which it encodes gender, race, politics, hides the capitalistic impulses of Disney behind it.
Right.
I think that you're seeing that insider-outsider question brought up very differently, which these are fans of Star Wars, but at the same time they're able to occupy a critical space in approaching the text.
Before I forget, I should mention that you are assistant professor. You sort of you went so fast the meeting that you are assistant professor at St. Mary's University, where you study and teach modern Islam as well as popular culture. You've been sort of mixing these, but also they're kind of two separate things in some ways for you.
Well, again, for me, a little bit of it is trying to pull the teeth out of a very aggressive so-called orthodoxy in Islam.
Right.
Is that there's a desire to see the tradition as it's currently imagined by petrodollars is very different from the tradition in history and the hearts of people in the local environments it occurs in. And I find that the popular culture in many ways is also a study of the popular religion and popular cultural forms of that religion, and sometimes it can look hokey and silly, but when you begin to appreciate the complexity of what's going on the ground, you can see it even in fan communities or at Comic-Con, like some scholars are now increasingly looking.
Yeah, no, I mean, but only beginning really, right? Within religious studies.
Within religious studies.
And you mentioned Henry Jenkins, right? I mean, so many of the authors in the book end up referencing him because he's one of the only people talking about this. But your comment about academic fans, the ACA fans, is interesting because I make a comment in the introduction, which I realized afterwards is somewhat untrue for me, and I didn't deliberately hide that, but I wasn't being self-reflective when I wrote it, which was that the possibility that for religious scholars, many of whom are religious or come out of religious traditions, if they're writing about that tradition that they have some familiarity or some affection for, it may be hard for them to be negative, right? To talk about the Buddha and sexism or something, right? But maybe with popular culture, if the stakes are a little bit lower, that conversation is not as difficult, right? But for me, it's the opposite. Because I wasn't raised in a religious tradition, I actually find it easier to be negative in some ways about religious figures than about the popular culture that I love. So that's where, in fact, I kind of I feel like I can empathize with other religious scholars.
Well, it seems that if you are a scholar who identifies with the tradition, that you are, I feel, sometimes required to be negative to prove that you can do it.
There's also that, So that's a good point too, actually. Yeah.
So that are you serious enough to be sitting at this table? And I think that sometimes the most important engagements with students often involve that critical shift in the scholar in front of them, right? Is that how did I move from being within a tradition or growing up near traditions and then starting to see them very differently and starting to look at them critically, academically. And for me, with Star Wars, because I was an immigrant to the US in the early 90s, I was trying to figure out where I could fit, and the racism was a little bit intense in small town Massachusetts. But at these cons, this one that was run there called Total Confusion, and it was an accepting space. It was a space in which my difference was not that remarkable because everyone else was a little bit odd. And so they just assumed that everything else was fine with me. And so it was a safe
That's
space.
really neat.
And
I didn't know that. That's really neat.
Well, that's where my Star Wars for me, because of material conditions, hadn't been available in a clean print that I could sit and watch until I came to the States.
Right.
And then that was happening at these little fan conventions, and that was so for me. Someone saying that that's religious made complete sense because it was like going to a saint's mazar or something to pray on his birthday or something like that.
There's a pilgrimage aspect very clearly.
Made a lot of sense.
And very ritualized and all of those things.
And they would have aspects of reenactment. There was a Rocky Horror element almost in the ways that people would view the Star Wars, they would be showing, and everyone would kind of lean over and like, have you seen the Christmas special?
Yeah.
I can slip it to you.
That's really neat. I really like the fact, working on the book was really lovely because as you said, the people contributing to it all clearly, I think love Star Wars much more than I do, and yet had this kind of troubled relationship with it. And so, to see people work through that, it's not just saying I really like this or this is terrible. It's the sort of middle space, which is, I think you get a lot of really neat thinking happening there, right? And very kind of thoughtful responses to a whole bunch of things, right? What's in the film, what's happening with fan communities, again, sort of good and bad. And you brought up teaching, right? To think about this in terms of how we teach religion to students, or the study of religion to students. It shouldn't, from my point of view anyway, it shouldn't just be about affirming, their beliefs or their instincts, whether those are critical towards religion or favorable. And it shouldn't just be about, tearing those things down, right? But getting them to ask new questions and getting them to be self-reflective and getting them to follow the evidence, and recognize that things can be complicated, and it's a bit like relationships with humans in that way, right?
Just allowing them to. That's one rule that I always give all of my students: is anytime the story is simple, someone's trying to sell you something.
Right.
So just be very critical of the way that even how your relationship kind of with your own family is. It's complicated. And so but if you're unwilling to see that, then it's very difficult for you to look at any kind of relationship very seriously or in a layered fashion. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on in all of these chapters. And I see the book as having three kind of modes. One is the studies that are from a bit of a step back, like what is this doing in terms of psychology, mythology, and then others that are playing a bit with gender and race, and then finally with kind of history and canonicity.
Right.
And I think the canonicity questions in particular are interesting because of what Disney decided to do to the canon.
Which a lot of people ended up commenting on.
Right.
As you know, we didn't give individual authors any kind of mandate or direction. We just said these are the kind of pieces, right, that we're playing with, right? So Star Wars and fandom and myth, and how do these go together for you? And then a lot of people kind of zoomed in on that moment, right, where Disney sort of announces, these things are no longer in the canon. And Ken McKendrick has this sort of lovely question about what does it mean to say something fictional isn't real, but this other fictional part is real. That's a really interesting, and then again to sort of bounce that off of how we deal with religions, and which these questions come up all the time, right? What counts and what doesn't count, and those questions also connect to who counts and who doesn't count.
Right.
So your experience in the with these conventions, right? In those spaces you count, but for some people they wouldn't maybe have felt that they counted or that they belonged.
Well, the Star Wars fandom has this notoriously hostile relationship with the creator, right? So with George Lucas, and it's that either he's not giving enough, or he's giving too much, or he's doing something too different, or he can't leave it alone. And so it seemed that the relationship to Star Wars also involved Lucas in many ways. You can tell there were films that came out, The People versus George Lucas, and but in 2012,
and these fan edits, right, that people created,
like Harmy's the
despecialized
edition, which is online, and everyone that hasn't seen it should see it.
Yes.
So, But when it goes finally to Disney, the process was very different. It seemed that there's no longer a figure to hate or get angry at.
Right.
Disney decides, just for marketability reasons, their declaration on their website is, we've gotten rid of the extended canon or the extended universe because we need more space to write new stuff for you to buy.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
And the sort of force behind that is diffused, right, into a company. So you might have like an individual making announcements or have some creative control, but it's not the same thing as Lucas, as the kind of god of the universe.
Right.
But and I didn't actually realize the complexity of all of that until people submitted their chapters. But it's fascinating. Like I love that photograph of, and this appeared in an earlier article by John Lydon, my co-editor. Of George Lucas wearing a T-shirt that says "Hand shot first." And he's wearing this T-shirt, at a time when he's arguing with fans and saying, no, Greedo shot first. It wasn't Han.
Right.
And yet he's going to wear this shirt, which was made by a fan.
Right.
And I love that the fact that Lucas again has these sort of multiple positions where he says, he openly says, I made these movies to be religious, essentially, right? That they were meant to be myths that teach people, values,
right.
Because they were meant to stand in for things like churches, which he perceived in the 70s, were becoming less influential. So we need something to step into that gap. And then on the other hand, he'll say, why are people so upset about this? It's just a movie, right?
Right.
And so
he's very indecisive about how he wants to feel about it, because he describes Disney buying his films as to Charlie Rose as being sold. My children being sold to white slavers.
And I didn't know that comment either. And many people, bring that out.
That one really shocked me. And it's because he I think has lost control of something he loves very much, like a child. And at the same time, he's not satisfied with the way he sent it out into the world.
Right.
And so he keeps wanting to fiddle, like right up until the Blu-ray releases in 2011. He's still changing things, especially with that Han Solo and Greedo fight in the cantina.
And I mean, that comment is also kind of illustrative of a sort of unconscious lack of thoughtfulness, politically and in terms of humans in the world. Like that's a terrible analogy to make, right? And it speaks to, when there was criticism of the lack of racial diversity in the Star Wars universe, the response was no, but there's so much diversity. We have purple beings and blue beings and beings with 8 eyes, and but you don't have any black people, right? Like how, like that's like why you have sort of alien diversity but not human diversity. And Dan and Joe's chapter, right? They sort of zero right in on that in an amazing way. One of the things I was thinking about, with when you're talking about your history with the franchise is, and then thinking about some of the issues that I raised about, what counts within academia, right? Is why you decided to participate in the project. I mean, aside from the fact that we've known each other for a little while now and we like each other, and I'm guessing maybe that was a factor, but why you wanted to be part of this, but also maybe why you were hesitant to be part of this.
Well, the hesitancy was over what we are identifying as this kind of classism in religious studies, that some things are worthy and some things are not worthy of study.
And you don't have tenure.
And I don't have tenure, and so that is a factor in that consideration. Like, how will this look? Will this be good? Will this be bad? But ultimately, I think the decision was not only because I value you both as a teacher of mine and as a friend, but it is something that I was thinking about in terms of identifying with this new space. So coming as an immigrant, I've been kind of doing that archaeology,
Okay.
And so I was thinking, like, what makes me connect to North America when I come as an immigrant? And these scholars, various scholars, were talking about it in terms of sharing collective memory and that's how you identify with a nation. That an immigrant's problems are because they don't share the collective memory of the nation.
This sort of imagined
community that Anderson would refer to. And so for me, it was how can I cash in on that imagination? And so I would obsessively watch television, even junk television, just to try and learn. I would practice saying words like an American in the shower. I would R is like water versus water.
Right, because of the way you were educated. Yeah.
And so all of that was part of how do I become a part of this community from a protective standpoint, because Massachusetts, despite how Boston is not nice when you're in the suburbs and you're of color, right? So it was an issue. And so,
and I mean, we've talked about this, like when you have things like the Oklahoma City bombing, right? When there's these eruptions of violence, right? And you're immediately the target.
Yeah, we received death threats at our house because of when the Oklahoma bombing happened. Initially, it was pinned on Muslims, and so there was this real nervousness, and I was thinking, like, what are the things that I need to know to be able to relate to an American or seem safe to an American? It was very important to me at the time. And Star Wars, when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, Star Wars was part of that story, of at least my coming here and being accepted. And it can also be done in a serious way while dealing with a kind of a fun subject. And so I was working with scholars who are dealing with memory and collective memory and how religion might work as a chain of memory.
I really like this idea a lot. I hadn't thought about it in these terms.
I believe the scholar is Hervé Léger, and she talks about religion as a chain of memory and the idea about how a tradition can be severed. And in this case, I saw that decanonization move as an attempt to sever a tradition.
Right.
And that it gives Lucas a very strange role, because I can't think of too many other writers that have been allowed, or writers or painters, or who are allowed to infinitely change the thing once it's out in the world.
Yeah.
And Lucas was doing that, and he was not releasing the earliest versions of the films to the Library of Congress to be archived, and he was making all of these. He was affecting the memory of the state and the society by making decisions about whether or not something would go into the memory banks, really. And so I thought all of that stuff was very important in identity construction, religious identity construction, and
how that relates to authority too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because that's where it is who do you center in your question about power and authority?
Yeah.
And so often when we're studying film, we're told the director is the power, is the authority. Like, so if you're going to study something like the neorealism, right? The director deliberately is picking non-actors because he doesn't want them to interrupt the beautiful vision that he has. And it is overwhelmingly he, right?
Yes.
And then when you have that shift to directors like Lucas, who can just keep intervening, keep changing, even when it's beloved and absorbed and sold. And then he's just allowing obsolescence to delete a version of Star Wars that mattered to people. And so it was, that stuff seemed very interesting to me in terms of, with religious groups as well. Would it be possible for Star Wars fans, this was maybe a little too broad a question, but would it be possible for Star Wars fans to say that this is my religion, and I have a First Amendment right to engage with this religion, with this religious material in a certain way against a copyright claim? Because
and you have this sort of legal background, right? So these are kinds of questions that will probably stick out to you.
Well, to me, it was that can there be copyright claims against, and free exercise claims? Like, do they smash into each other a little bit? Because my launching point was to say, let's take it seriously as a religion and look at it. And so what kind of religion is it? What kind of tradition, what kind of memories do the people have in it? And
it's interesting. I saw this play out, people that are close to me who, belong to, let's say, there's a couple of people I know who belong to the Anglican Church in Canada. And, when there are these conversations going on about, well, should we ordain openly gay ministers? And you see, in some ways, on reflection, right, the same kind of conversations and upheaval as you do with these Star Wars communities and these canon issues, where the decision gets made, and then all these questions about, well, the tradition has been or is, and well, if if you can just change this, does any of this matter what happened in the past? And then you get these schisms where people they're like, well, this is no longer the church that I joined, because it doesn't reflect my values. And so, I mean, you get these same kinds of things with the things like the despecialized edition, where people are creating their own form of this because they feel that's a more authentic representation. And a lot of that, in some ways, comes to it's a matter of kind of memory, holding on to memory, but also kind of freezing things in a certain way, right? So there's this whole other tension between maintaining tradition, but also like things need to shift and grow and move and change. So what degree of change and movement is okay? But in your chapter, you kind of also talk about the fact that even when there's that movement and change, the memories get shifted to almost sort of pretend that hasn't happened. Right. So you can feel that there's this unbroken kind of line. Right. It's so fascinating, I think.
Well, I find memory especially to be a very interesting place to play, because there's a sense that when so much of our truth lies in our memories. And when we think more about, and when neuroscientists talk about how flexible that stuff actually is, how frequently we're inventing our past and our memories, that when you start looking at it from that angle, you're sort of seeing a tradition also doing what an individual is doing in the micro scale, is that you're rewriting constantly, you're rewriting yourself, and that the tradition is kind of doing that too. And more obviously in some cases with Vatican II, and less obviously in some, Star Wars, it's
and again, there are these the degrees of that, right? Of rupture. Like Disney comes in and says this doesn't count. That's a Vatican II moment, essentially. But then you've got and George Lucas doing these amazing things where he says things like, I didn't change it, but he obviously did, right? Like the Greedo hand thing is the archetype of that.
And also you see a little bit of the way he understands his relationship to his work evolving over in some of these pieces as well, is that he goes from lamenting that he is Star Wars George Lucas, that he can't do anything else now without being Star Wars George Lucas.
Because he wants to be an artist.
And so the way he's living his art is by making Star Wars the way he imagined it in his head.
Yeah, or the way he thinks he imagined it in his head.
Right. And he's upset that Han shoots Greedo first. Right? He's like, because either Han is a scoundrel who needs redemption when he dies in The Force Awakens, or he's a selfless hero
from the beginning,
who sacrifices himself for selfless hero causes.
Right? And it's hard to know. Like, I mean, what was in his mind when he made it? Because you assume, I mean, we assume often that the way he made it was the way he wanted to make it. But maybe he's right. Maybe he never really wanted to do that, and that was a mistake he made. And he didn't really think it through, and so he's trying to correct a mistake. But part of me thinks he's misremembering. That he thinks he thought this, but maybe he didn't think that, and he just in retrospect he's like, oh no, Han was always supposed to be this selfless hero.
It's the difference between a director who shows a lot of promise and a multi-billionaire, like ruling over an empire, right? Like these are two very different characters who are living out this narcissist fantasy in some
And it would be nice to see him. I haven't seen it anyway. It'd be nice to see him reflect on that, how his relationship. Because he talks a lot about how his relationship to Star Wars changes because of fan involvement. But he doesn't talk about how it changes, or at least not that I've seen, with his own transformation, right, as a human, right? I mean, not just becoming a billionaire, but all of the other things, right, that go along with your life as you get older, right? People dying and so forth. Children growing up. How does that affect his relationship to these things that he's created, and how he looks at them?
Well, so much of when we're talking to students or anyone about looking at art is people will say, well, how much do I go into the biography of the artist? Like, how much should I try to figure out whether that shadow is his father? So that those kind of questions will come up a lot for people as they're studying art. And we often are telling them that just look at the thing on its own, that analyze it for what it is, and don't like Roland Barthes or others would say, like, the artist is dead, like step away from it. And or the author is dead.
Because you don't get the nice, mort d'auteur, right? The pun. If it's the artist, that doesn't work. The mort d'artiste. There's no pun.
So I think that so if you turn around and you turn back to the piece and the artist has changed something, wait, what? I just got through telling you that,
you're not there. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think too. I mean, with a lot of sacred texts, obviously we don't know the authors, and so we can't even do that sort of speculation. And to some extent, people try to reconstruct, what was going on or what was the audience and so forth. But here, like you said, we have this right in front of us, and it's passing us by, and we need to get on this.
Well, for me, I find that with having a little bit of a background in law, that the test for me for religion tends to come from the legal understanding of the sincerity test. And so a lot of times I wonder, are fans sincere in their...
What's the legal...
Well, it's more kind of understanding of a sense of conscience. So for example, if a conscientious objector doesn't want to join the army, do they have to be a Seventh-day Adventist, or can they be can they belong to the no war group and then sincerely believe that they shouldn't do that? And so the test in the US law at least has been a sincerity test, which tends to evaluate the individual.
Right.
And so in that sense, it makes
as opposed
sense.
to, are you just being strategic?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Or like you actually believe this.
Or saying that you're not a part of a tradition, right? You don't get to make up your own tradition to avoid that, or have bone spurs or something.
Right. That doesn't, that's not a thing.
but so for the law, they're just checking for sincerity, right? That's what matters.
Yeah.
And so for these fans, very famously, there was this trial in the 90s where someone came dressed in Star Trek uniform. Do you remember this?
No.
And they were asked why, and they wanted to swear on the kind of Federation rules. And they said, why? And they said, well, I don't believe in the Bible sincerely in the way I believe in Star Trek sincerely. Yeah. And it caused a bit of a media flare-up because people were so excited about the idea that someone would wear something that represented what people thought was the best of human effort and ingenuity was in Star Trek, and that it imagined a world of fairness without monetary gain, and so just a better world. And wouldn't you want that on the
Sheldon
journal?
on The Big Bang Theory is that character essentially, right, where he very explicitly repudiates the religion of his mother, right? Sort of evangelical Christianity, but he's very religious when it comes to things like Star Trek. Like those things matter immensely to him.
Right, and not to devolve into saying that every person has that religious core, which they're just filling in one way or the other. But in this case, what is the stuff that will make this person go crazy and write on a forum online? And it'll be Star Trek, not religion. So
well, one of the I can't remember. I sort of came across it, and I stuck it in the introduction. Was Sam Harris's comment, where he's being critical of religion and saying this is all very ridiculous, and then he says, can you imagine a world, where people would threaten to kill people because of interpretations of Star Wars, and what kind of world would that be to live in? And it's like, well, that's the actual world we live in, right? People do in fact issue death threats. I mean, Rose Tico got death threats just because of the character she played. That's not even about an interpretation of a text, but her involvement in a way that upset people, and there was a newswoman who made a disparaging comment about fans, being too kind of obsessive, and she was very belittling and got death threats immediately. So not to say that threatening death is a sign that we're in religious territory, but that's that is an indication of how much this matters to people. And I mean, part of the impetus of the book was to talk about how much sometimes religions matter to people in ways that are harmful or are very, very unhealthy. And so so you do have this amazing sort of spectrum, right? And we often talk about meaningfulness as if it's just a positive thing, but you could find racism meaningful.
And nationalism.
Yes,
others, right?
I mean, we're living in a moment now where this is very apparent.
Right, and I feel that when you're not able to, it's sort of Sam Harris in that comment is exposing that he thinks that certain things are worthy to die for, like the nation, an invention is worthy to die for. But or your football team that you like the most is worthy to get in a fight over, but not religion or not Star Trek, surely.
That's true.
And especially that kind of the sincerity test is being vetted in a weird way, because when increasingly in surveys, I remember there was that famous one in Australia where they asked people's religion, and a lot of people wrote in Jedi, and that are we meant to take that as these people are just trying to screw with the census?
Yeah.
Or is there maybe some sincerity to that claim? And how does it manifest?
Yeah.
Because spiritual, not religious, and saying, may the force be with you,
right,
doesn't sound that different.
Yeah. Well,
in
and
some cases.
you had two friends. I mean, you very kindly sent me a photograph. You had two friends who got married in a Star Wars wedding.
Yeah.
And that was part of the vow, or part of the
sincerity for them.
Well, and part of the ritual. Yeah, that was part of the liturgy, wasn't it? Was
Yeah.
may the force be with you.
Absolutely.
Right, with
Absolutely.
and the two kids with the lightsabers, and they went under that sort of arch.
And there were frowning faces in the audience.
Well, were there? Oh, nice.
At this performance, but
Yeah.
at the same time, at least my feeling was, they are trying to root it
Yeah.
in something that's deeply important for them,
Yeah.
for their own tradition and
Yeah.
the one that they've identified with and connect to. So sure, why not?
Yeah, and that's tough when Kelly and I got married, because neither one of us was part of a tradition, and we're trying to create something, right? And we didn't create it using pop culture, right? But we tried to figure out, and that's a tough thing to do without some kind of architecture there, right? That you can link with. Or plug into in some way, and these are a lot of mixed metaphors. But and so if you have that, it just makes so much sense to draw on that, and that's a very lovely, positive example, I think, of people doing that, as opposed to the white supremacists.
Right.
I generally don't describe as lovely and wonderful. Yeah.